Too near the top, the outside, said Gog, shuddering. That's the worst thing the witch did to us. We're going to be let out into the open, onto the outside world. They say there's no roof at all up there, only a horrible great emptiness called the sky. And the diggings have gone so far that a few strokes of the pick would bring you out into it. I wouldn't dare go near them. Hurrah! Now you're talking, said Eustace. And Jill said, But it's not horrid at all up there. We like it. We live up there. I know you overlands live there, said Gulg, but I thought it was because you couldn't find your way down inside. You can't really like it. Crawling about like flies on the top of the world? What about showing us this road at once? Said Puddleglum. In a good hour, said the prince. The whole party set out. The prince remoted his charger. Puddleglum climbed up behind Jill, and Gulg led the way. And as he went, he kept shouting out the good news that the witch was dead and that the 4 overlanders were not dangerous. And those who heard him shouted it on to others, so that in a few minutes the whole of Underland was ringing with shouts and cheers, and gnomes by hundreds and thousands, leaping, turning cartwheels, standing on their heads, playing leapfrog, and letting off huge crackers, came pressing round Coal-Black and Snowflake. Those would be the horses. And the prince had to tell the story of his enchantment and deliverance at least 10 times. In this way they came to the edge of the chasm. It was about a few thousand feet long, and perhaps 200 wide. They dismounted from their horses and came to the edge, and looked down into it. A strong heat smote about into their faces, mixed with a smell which was quite unlike any they had ever smelled. It was rich, sharp, exciting, and made you sneeze. The depth of the chasm was so bright that at first it dazzled their eyes, and they could see nothing. When they got used to it, they thought they could make out a river of fire, and on the banks of the river what seemed to be fields and groves and unbearable hot brilliance. So they were dim compared with the river. There were blues, reds, greens, and whites all jumbled together. A very good stained glass window with a tropical sun staring straight through it at midday might have something like the same effect. Down the rugged sides of the chasm, looking black like flies against that fiery light, hundreds of earthmen were climbing. Your honors, said Gulg, and when they were turned to look at him they could see nothing but blackness for a few minutes. Their eyes were so dazzled. Your honors, why don't you come down to Bism? You'd be happier there than you would be in that cold, unprotected, naked country out on top. Or at least you could come down for a short visit. Truly, Jill, I almost skipped a paragraph, sorry. Jill took it for granted that none of the others would listen to such an idea for a moment. To her horror, she heard the prince saying, Truly, friend Gulg, I have half a mind to come down with you, for this is a marvelous adventure, and it may be no mortal man has ever looked into Bism before or will ever have the chance to again. And I know not how, as the years pass, I shall bear to remember that it was once in my power to have probed the uttermost pit of the earth, and that I forbear. But could a man live there? You do not swim in the fire river itself. No, your honor, not we. It's only the salamanders live in the fire itself. What kind of beast is your salamander? Asked the prince. It's hard to tell their kind, your honor, said Gulg, for they are too white-hot to look at, but they are most like small dragons. They speak to us out of the fire. They are wonderfully clever with their tongues, very witty and eloquent. Jill glanced hastily at Eustace. She had felt for sure that he would like the idea of climbing down that chasm even less than she did. Her heart sank, and she saw that his face was quite changed. He looked more like the prince than like the old scrub at the experiment house. For all his adventures in the days when he had sailed with King Caspian were coming back to him. Your Highness, he said, if my old friend Reepicheep the mouse were here, he would say that we could not now refuse the adventures of Bism without a great impeachment to our honor. Down there, said Gold, I should show you real gold, real silver, real diamonds. Bosh, said Jew rudely, as if we didn't know that we're below the deepest mines even here. Yes, said Golg. I have heard of those little scratches in the crust that you top dwellers call mines. But that's where you get dead gold, dead silver, dead gems. Down in Bism we have them alive and growing. There I'll pick you bunches of rubies that you can take and eat and squeeze into a cup of diamond juice. You won't care how much about the fingering cold, dead treasures of your shallow mine after you've tasted the live ones of Bism. My father went to the world's end, said Rillian thoughtfully. It would be a marvelous thing if his son went to the bottom of the world. If your highness wants to see your father while he's still alive, which I think he'd prefer, said Puddleglum, it's about time we were getting into that road to the diggings. And I won't go down that hole, whatever anyone says, said Jill. Why, if your honors are really set to go back to Overworld, said Golg, there is one bit of road that's rather lower than this, and perhaps if that flood's still rising. Oh, do, come on, begged Jill. I fear it must be so, said the prince with a deep sigh. But I left half of my heart in the land of Bism. Please, said Jill. Where is the road? Asked Puddleglum. There are lamps along the way, said Golg. Your honor can see the beginning of the road on the far side of the chasm. How long will the lamps burn for? Asked Puddleglum. At that moment, a hissing, scorching voice, like the voice of fire itself, they wondered afterwards if it could have been a salamander's, came whistling out of the very depth of Bism. Quick, to the cliffs, to the cliffs, to the cliffs, it said. The rift closes, it closes, quick. And at the same time, with ear-shattering cracks and creaks, the rock moved. Already, while they looked, the chasm was narrower. From every side, belated gnomes were rushing into it. They would not wait to climb down the rocks. They flung themselves headlong end, either because so strong a blast of hot air was beating up from the bottom, or for some other reason they could be seen floating downward like leaves. Thicker and thicker they floated, till the blackness almost blotted out the fiery river and the groves of live gems. Goodbye, your honors, I'm off, said Golg, and dived in. Only a few were left behind to follow him. The chasm was now no broader than a stream. Now it was narrower as the slit in a pillar box. Now it was only an intensely bright thread. Then, with a shock like 1,000 good trains coming crashing into thousands of pairs of buffers, the lips of the rock closed. The hot, maddening smell vanished. The travelers were alone in an underworld which now looked far blacker than before. Pale, dim, and dreary, the lamps marked the direction of the road. Now, said Puddleglum, it's 10 to 1. We've already stayed too long. But we may as well make it a try. Those lamps will give out in 5 minutes, I shouldn't wonder. They urged the horses to a canter, and thundered along the dusky road in fine style. But almost at once it began going downhill. They would have thought that Golg had sent them the wrong way if they had not seen on the other side of the valley the lamps going on and upward as far as the eye could reach. But at the bottom of the valley the lamps shone on moving water. Haste, cried the prince. They galloped down the slope. It would have been nasty enough at the bottom even 5 minutes later, for the tide was running up the valley like mill race, and even if it had come to swimming, the horses could hardly have won over. But it was still only a foot or two deep, and though it swished terribly around the horses' legs, they reached the far side in safety. Then began the slow, weary march uphill, with nothing ahead to look at but the pale lamps, which went up and up as far as the eye could reach. When they looked back they could see the water spreading. All the hills of Underland were now islands, and it was only on those islands that the lamps remained. Every moment some distant light vanished. Soon there would be total darkness everywhere except on the road they were following, and even on the lower part of it behind them no lamps had yet gone out. No lamp shone on water. I don't understand that paragraph, or that sentence, so I'm going to read it again. Soon there would be total darkness everywhere except on the road they were following, and even on the lower part of it behind them, though no lamps had yet gone out, the lamplight shone on the water. That makes more sense to me. Alright. Although they had good reason for hurrying, the horses could not go on forever without a rest. They halted, and in silence they could hear the lapping of water. "I wonder, is what's-his-name, Father Time, flooded out now?" said Jill. "And all those queer sleeping animals." "I don't think we're as high as that," said Eustace. "Don't you remember how we had to go downhill to reach the Sunless Sea? I shouldn't think the water has reached Time's cave yet." "That's as may be," said Puddleglum. "I'm more interested in the lamps on this road. Look a bit sickly, don't they?" Such an upbringer. "They always did," said Jill. "Ah," said Puddleglum, "but they're greener now." "You don't mean to say that they're going out?" cried Eustace. "Well, however they work, you can't expect them to last forever, you know," said the Marshwiggle. "But don't let your spirits down, Scrub. I've got my eye on the water too, and I don't think it's rising as fast as it did." "Small comfort, friend," said the Prince. "If we cannot find our way out, I cry you mercy all. I am to blame for my pride and fantasy which delayed us by the mouth of the land of Bism. Now let us ride on." During the hour or so that followed, Jill sometimes thought that Puddleglum was right about the lamps, and sometimes thought it was only her imagination. Meanwhile the land was changing. The roof of Underland was so near that even by the dull light they could now see it quite distinctly, and the great rugged wall of Underland could be seen drawing closer on each side. The road, in fact, was leading them into a steep tunnel. They began to pass picks and shovels and barrows and other signs that the diggers had recently been working at. If only they could be sure of getting out, all of this was very cheering. But the thought of going into a hole, and that would get narrower and narrower and harder to turn in, was unpleasant. At last, the roof was so low that Puddleglum and the Prince knocked their heads against it. The party dismounted and led the horses. The road was so uneven here that one had to pick one's steps with some care. That was how Jill noticed the growing darkness. There was no doubt about it now. The faces of the others looked strange and ghastly in the green glow. Then, all at once, she couldn't help it, Jill gave a little scream. One light, the next one ahead, went out altogether. Then one behind them did the same. Then they were in absolute darkness. "Courage, friends," came Prince Rilian's voice. "Whether we live or die, Aslan will be our good lord." "That's right, sir," said Puddleglum's voice, "and you must always remember there's one good thing about being trapped down here. It'll save funeral expenses." Jill held her tongue. "If you didn't want any other people to know how frightened you are, this is always a wise thing to do. It's your voice that gives you away." "We might as well go on as stand here," said Eustace, and when she heard the tremble in his voice, Jill knew how wise she'd been not to trust her own. Puddleglum and Eustace went first with their arms stretched out in front of them, for fear of blundering into anything. Jill and the Prince followed, leading the horses. "I say," came Eustace's voice much later, "are my eyes going queer, or is there a patch of light up there?" Before anyone could answer him, Puddleglum called out, "Stop! I'm up against a dead end, and it's earth, not rock. What were you saying, Scrub?" "By the line," said the Prince, "Eustace is right. There is a sort of... But it's not daylight," said Jill. "It's only a cold blue sort of light." "Better than nothing, though," said Eustace. "Can we get up to it?" "It's not right overhead," said Puddleglum. "It's above us. But it's in this wall that I've run into. How would we How would it be, Paul, if you got on my shoulders and saw whether you could get up onto it? The end of chapter 14.